Rebecca James, a veteran haunted by the Kandahar ambush and the loss of her friends, returns to her changing hometown of Maple Hill for a Memorial Day speech. Mayor Dalton, the new forward-thinking mayor, advocates for non-combative civic duty, downplaying military sacrifice. During the ceremony, the mayor shockingly declares, "Please don't let her speak in front of the children," just before Rebecca is to address the crowd. A heavy silence follows. What will Rebecca say in response to this public dismissal of her service and the meaning of Memorial Day? If Rebecca's story resonated with you, join our community for more powerful narratives on true service. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell to support stories that matter. Your engagement helps us bring more quiet strength to light. Thank you for watching. The mayor's voice was a low hiss, barely concealing his contempt. "Don't let her speak in front of the kids," he muttered to an aide, his words sharp with dismissal. To him, she was a relic, a figure who didn't align with the polished vision he had for their small town. But that morning, his words were drowned by a silence more powerful than any speech. On the steps of City Hall, over 400 veterans stood side by side, their presence a quiet thunder. No chants, no banners, just the glint of medals pinned to weathered jackets, the weight of lives given, and a stillness that commanded reverence. They arrived one by one, each. The bus rolled into Maple Hills Station just as the sun broke the horizon, its brakes sighing into the crisp morning air. Rebecca James stepped down, her boots touching the ground with deliberate care, the weight of her duffel bag tugging at her shoulder. The town greeted her with the scent of freshly cut grass, the faint rumble of diesel from a distant truck, and the sweet whisper of lilacs blooming somewhere nearby. But it was the quiet that hit her hardest, a stillness that felt both familiar and foreign. It had been more than 10 years since she'd last walked these streets. Maple Hill, tucked deep in the Midwest, had once brimmed with pride, American flags fluttering on every porch, Memorial Day parades stretching from dawn to dusk, clogging Main Street with laughter and music. Now the town felt changed. The flags were fewer, their colors dulled by time. Stores she remembered from childhood were gone, replaced by trendy coffee shops with sleek logos and chalkboard menus promising artisanal blends. Others stood empty, their windows coated in dust, staring blankly at the street. Rebecca adjusted her blazer, the sleeve tailored to conceal the prosthetic that extended just below her elbow. Her uniform remained folded in her bag, untouched since the last military funeral she'd attended. These days, she preferred simplicity, plain clothes that drew fewer stares, fewer questions. The invitation to speak at Maple Hill's Memorial Day ceremony had arrived out of the blue, a curt email from the town council. She'd nearly deleted it. Public speaking wasn't her strength, especially not about the war, but something in the message pulled at her. Perhaps it was the signature at the bottom. Mayor Dalton, a name she didn't know. Or maybe it was the echo of her grandfather's voice, steady and warm, urging her to stand tall. She turned off Main Street, her steps carrying her toward the small cemetery just beyond the Baptist church. The path was unchanged, lined with the same cracked stones she'd walked as a girl. The names carved into the headstones were familiar, like old friends. She found them under the sprawling oak tree. James Pop Harlan, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Vietnam. He'd raised her after her parents were lost, frying eggs for breakfast before school, teaching her to aim a rifle and to carry herself with dignity. "Hey, Pop," she whispered, kneeling beside his grave. "I'm back, not sure what I'm doing here, but I'm here." A soft breeze rustled the oak's leaves, and for a long moment she stayed, the silence wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. This wasn't the homecoming she'd pictured, but it felt like the one she needed. The hum of cicadas in Maple Hill was a far cry from the sounds that haunted Rebecca's nights. In the quiet hours, her dreams still carried the sharp crack of gunfire, the dull thud of explosions in the distance, the hiss of radio static that always signaled trouble. 8 years had passed since the ambush in Kandahar province. The pain of that day was a blur, but the adrenaline, the grit of sand, the metallic tang of blood, she remembered those vividly. Her unit had been stationed near a girls' school, a fragile outpost of hope often targeted by militants who saw knowledge as a threat. Rebecca could still see the girls' faces, small hands gripping notebooks, eyes carrying a weight no child should bear. The attack came during morning drills, Oh, yes. A relentless barrage that stretched for hours. Three of her closest friends, Michael, Sarah, and Damon, didn't make it. She barely did. The prosthetic was a visible scar, but the deeper wounds were invisible, buried in her chest. Survivor's guilt was heavier than the body armor she'd once worn, a constant ache that whispered, "Why me? Why not them?" Each had families waiting, spouses, children, lives unfinished. She had only silence. The military had honored her with medals, solemn ceremonies, and folded flags for her fallen teammates. Then they'd sent her home. In Colorado, she found purpose again, not in the uniform, but in service. She volunteered with veteran outreach programs, helping others navigate the shadows she knew too well. Rebecca moved through life with a quiet purpose, organizing local food drives for those too stubborn to admit they needed help. She found solace not in grand gestures or public praise, but in the small, steady acts of showing up and listening. The word hero grated against her nerves, tossed around too lightly, like a casual thank you in the grocery store checkout line. "Thank you for your service, hero." She'd offer a polite nod, but the term churned in her gut. To her, heroism wasn't about medals or accolades. It was about sacrifice, the kind that left empty chairs at family dinners. The real heroes, she believed, were the ones who never made it home. When local groups occasionally coaxed her to speak at small gatherings, she did so reluctantly, steering clear of tales about firefights or covert missions. Instead, she spoke of people, flawed, hopeful human beings who loved fiercely, lost deeply, and stood for something greater than themselves. Now Maple Hill was calling her back, asking her to step onto a stage and address the town on Memorial Day. The weight of expectation settled over her, not as trauma but as a familiar burden, like a rucksack she could never quite set down. Expectation and pain, she learned, were two sides of the same heavy coin. As she wandered down Main Street, memories flickered like old film reels. The bookstore, its faded sign barely legible, once buzzed with Friday night readings where poets and dreamers shared their words. The diner, with its chipped countertops, still held the echo of her grandfather's laughter as they shared slices of pecan pie after Sunday church. Some passers-by recognized her, offering quick waves or knowing nods. Others lingered too long, their gazes tracing the uneven rhythm of her walk, the quiet intensity in her eyes, wondering if this was the same Rebecca James they'd known as a girl. Inside Maple Hill Cafe, the bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped in, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon and slightly scorched coffee. For a fleeting moment, she was 16 again, sprawled across the corner booth, her nose buried in textbooks. "Rebecca James," came a warm, familiar voice. She turned to see Martha Ellison, her old high school history teacher, standing behind the counter, balancing two steaming mugs. Martha's silver hair was swept into a neat bun, her smile as inviting as it had been years ago. "Didn't think I'd see you back in this town." "Wasn't sure I'd come back," Rebecca admitted, her voice soft but steady. They settled at a small table by the window, sunlight spilling across the worn wooden floor, casting gentle shadows that danced with their words. Martha didn't mince words. "Heard you're speaking on Memorial Day." Rebecca nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "That's the plan." Martha's eyes narrowed, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Not everyone's happy about it." Rebecca arched an eyebrow, inviting more. "Mayor Dalton," Martha said, the name laced with a hint of disdain. "Young, new, got himself elected on promises of unity and forward-thinking community pride. Sounds fine until you hear him call traditional patriotism dangerous." Rebecca took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the words settle. "Dangerous?" "He thinks honoring war glorifies violence," Martha explained. "Wants to focus on peaceful service, volunteering, environmental work, city planning. Calls it non-combative civic duty." Rebecca tilted her head, considering. "Not a terrible idea," she said carefully. Martha nodded but leaned closer. "No, it's not. But he uses it to dismiss military sacrifice. Says we shouldn't romanticize conflict. Word is he's speaking before you at the ceremony." Rebecca's gaze drifted to the town square outside, where volunteers were arranging folding chairs in neat rows. "Let him speak," she said evenly. Martha's eyes gleamed with concern. Just be ready. He doesn't think there's a place for uniforms or medals in his vision of Maple Hill. A faint smile tugged at Rebecca's lips. Then maybe he needs a reminder of what those uniforms and medals actually mean. By mid-morning, Maple Hill's town square had transformed into a vibrant tableau of patriotism. White chairs lined the grass, draped with red, white, and blue bunting that fluttered in the breeze. Small American flags sprouted from lampposts, catching the sunlight. The local high school band fumbled through warm-up notes under a shaded canopy, while volunteers handed out programs printed in bold red and blue ink. At the front, a modest stage held a simple podium, a few folding chairs, and a weathered statue of a doughboy soldier standing watch, its bronze surface softened by time. Rebecca arrived quietly, her navy blue dress uniform crisp despite the years. The left sleeve hung empty, neatly folded at the elbow, a silent testament to her own sacrifice. She wore no Medal of Honor today. This wasn't about her. It was about those who hadn't come home. As she moved through the crowd, heads turned. Some offered respectful nods, their eyes warm with recognition. Others whispered, their gazes lingering on the woman who carried both strength and loss in her stride. The townsfolk watched with a mix of intrigue and restraint, their eyes tracing Rebecca James as she stepped into the square, her presence stirring whispers like a breeze through autumn grass. No one quite knew how to interpret her return. Some offered tentative smiles, others leaned forward with guarded curiosity, as if her very existence carried a story they weren't sure they wanted to hear. She moved with quiet confidence, her steps deliberate, her face betraying nothing as she approached the reserved seat near the front. No grand flourishes, no speeches to herald her arrival, just the steady grace of someone who had faced the unimaginable and come out the other side. Mayor Dalton stood at the podium, his polished gray suit catching the morning light, projecting the image of a man crafted for campaign posters rather than the gritty work of public service. His smile when he greeted Rebecca was a fleeting thing, warm on the surface but hollow in its depths, never quite touching his eyes. He leaned toward her, voice low and clipped. "We'll start soon. I'll say a few words before you take the stage." Rebecca gave a single nod, her expression unreadable, and settled into her seat as the national anthem swelled through the air, followed by the crisp presentation of colors. When Mayor Dalton took the microphone, his voice cut through the morning with the clarity of a seasoned orator. "Good morning, friends and neighbors," he began, his tone warm yet commanding. "Today, we come together not just to look back, but to reimagine what service means in our modern world." His words flowed effortlessly, painting a vision of community gardens blooming with hope, youth mentorship programs shaping bright futures, and environmental initiatives preserving the land for generations to come. The crowd nodded along, lulled by his eloquence, but a shift in his tone snapped their attention taut. "We must move beyond outdated notions of heroism tied to conflict," he declared, his voice sharpening. "While we honor our veterans, we must be careful not to glorify violence, especially in front of our children." His gaze flicked toward Rebecca, deliberate and spacecraft pointed. "Please, don't let her speak in front of the kids." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs that rustled like dry leaves caught in a gust. Rebecca sat motionless, her jaw tight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, her composure a silent rebuke to the mayor's words. In the third row, a group of older men, their faces etched with years of hard-won wisdom, sat up straighter, their eyes narrowing. A Marine in full-dress uniform, his chest adorned with ribbons, slowly removed his cap, the gesture heavy with meaning. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, thick and charged, a warning woven into the stillness that demanded respect. Rebecca rose from her seat with measured grace, her eyes never straying toward Mayor Dalton. His words had cut deep, sharp, and intentional, but she didn't need to acknowledge them to make their weight felt. The crowd's attention shifted, every gaze locking onto her as she approached the podium with the steady stride of someone who had walked through fire and learned to keep moving. She adjusted the microphone, letting a single breath pass before her voice broke the silence. "Good morning," she said, her tone calm, devoid of theatrics but rich with purpose. "I've heard it said that people like me are relics, that honoring military service sends the wrong message to the next generation. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, not out of anger, but with the clarity of someone who had earned the right to speak. I'm not here to glorify war. No one who's seen it up close could ever do that. I'm here because I lost friends who were like family to me, and they deserve to be remembered. Her gaze swept over the crowd, steady and unflinching. Parents pulled their children a little closer. Veterans sat rigid, their faces carved with memories they didn't need to voice. 8 years ago, she continued, I was deployed to a small province outside Kandahar, Afghanistan. My unit had one mission: protect a girls' school, one of the only ones in the region. Those girls walked for hours every day, risking everything just to learn to read, to write, to dream. The Taliban had vowed to burn that school to the ground. We were there to make sure that didn't happen. Her hands rested lightly on the podium, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. The attack came just after dawn. We fought for hours, wave after wave. 3 of my closest teammates didn't make it home. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if seeing their faces again. Captain Michael Rodriguez, she said, her voice softening. He had twin daughters, just babies then. They're almost teenagers now, growing up without him. She opened her eyes, her gaze piercing. Lieutenant Sarah Khan, a combat medic who never hesitated to run into danger to save a life. Sergeant Damon Wallace, who carried a wounded child out of the crossfire and went back for another. That's when he was taken. Her voice didn't waver, but the weight of her words settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. They didn't die for glory or politics or shiny medals. They died because they believed some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. Rebecca stood taller, her presence commanding the square. That school still stands today. Those girls are still learning, still walking those dusty roads. Some of them are training to become doctors, teachers, engineers. That's not a story about war. That's a story about what's possible when people stand up for something bigger than themselves. Her voice softened, but its strength remained. Memorial Day isn't about celebrating destruction. It's about remembering the sacrifices that make hope possible. The morning sun rose over Maple Hill, casting a soft glow on the quiet town, but the stillness was deceptive. Something profound was stirring, a silent force gathering strength. By 8:12 a.m., the sleepy sidewalks outside City Hall were alive with purpose. Veterans arrived in waves, first a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Some wore pressed dress blues, their medals gleaming like stars in the daylight. Others donned faded service jackets, VFW caps, or worn combat boots paired with jeans, their attire a patchwork of pride and history. A few sat in wheelchairs, faces etched with resolve. Others leaned on canes, their steps deliberate but unwavering. They stood together, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward, their presence a wordless declaration of honor. No chants echoed, no signs waved, no voices rose in protest. Their silence was their strength, a statement felt rather than spoken. The day before, Rebecca James had stood at the podium in the town square, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of loss. She didn't speak of glory or victory, but of the men and women whose names were carved into the memorial behind her, their lives cut short, their dreams left unfinished. She shared their laughter, their fears, the quiet moments that made them human, and the duty to carry their memory forward. As she stepped back, the square fell silent, the air thick with shared grief and a reverence that bound the crowd as one. One by one, veterans rose to their feet, their movement slow but purposeful, a tribute to the fallen and to Rebecca's words. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, letting them witness the moment. Some wiped tears from their cheeks, others saluted, and a few stood with hands over hearts, faces etched with pride and pain. The applause began softly, a few hesitant claps from the back, but it grew into a wave, a collective release that swept through the square. Rebecca didn't smile. She gave a single nod, her eyes carrying the weight of unspoken truths, and returned to her seat with the quiet humility that defined her. Mayor Dalton, rigid at the stage's edge, watched with a face that betrayed no emotion, though his jaw twitched with the effort to stay composed. When he took the microphone, his voice was flat, his words measured. Thank you, Captain James, for that perspective, he said, trying to smooth over the raw emotion still lingering. Though I still believe it's time we move toward more modern, peaceful values in our civic traditions. The crowd didn't applaud. A low murmur rippled through, a quiet dissent heavier than any cheer. A woman in the third row stood, her gray hair catching the light, her voice sharp and clear. My son died in Iraq, she said. Don't you dare call that outdated. The silence that followed was heavier than any before, a moment where the world seemed to pause. The ceremony ended quietly without fanfare. The wreath-laying was somber, the band's music soft and restrained. People left in small groups, some exchanging hushed words, others shaking Rebecca's hand with quiet gratitude. But the story didn't end there. That night, a shaky cell phone video from the event spread online, capturing Mayor Dalton's muttered aside before Rebecca's speech. Please don't let her speak in front of the children. Then it cut to Rebecca's unwavering words, her message resolute. By midnight, the clip had raced across veteran forums, local news, and national social media. Hashtags like "Honor is not outdated" and "Let her speak" trended, and "Memorial Day Matters" became a rallying cry. Veterans from nearby counties connected, their messages buzzing through forums and chats. Plans formed in quiet corners of the internet, not out of anger, but a shared need to stand for something greater. We stand with Rebecca James, the post read. If you can be in Maple Hill by morning, bring your uniform, bring your medals, bring your silence. It wasn't about politics or even Dalton anymore. It was about respect, about drawing a line where too many had been crossed. Rebecca, alone in her hotel room, knew none of this. She had turned off her phone, packed her bag, and planned to take the early bus home, believing her role was done. But for hundreds of others, it was just beginning. As dawn broke, Maple Hill's streets hummed with purpose. By 10 o'clock a.m., over 400 veterans lined the steps of City Hall, their formation solemn, their silence profound. Civilians gathered along the sidewalks, watching in quiet awe, some offering chairs or water to the older veterans in front. Reporters scrambled to set up cameras, sensing the moment's weight without fully understanding it. Mayor Dalton arrived late, briefcase in hand, his usual confidence faltering as he faced the sea of uniforms. His face paled, his lips pressed tight. He paused, scanning the rows of veterans, their medals catching the sun. For a moment he seemed diminished, dwarfed by their presence. Then, squaring his shoulders, he pushed through, eyes averted, and slipped inside City Hall. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. The mayor clutched a cigarette in one hand, a paper cup of coffee trembling slightly in the other. His steps faltered as he approached the building, where a solemn line of veterans stood like sentinels across its facade. His face paled, the color leaching away as if drained by the weight of their presence. With measured, almost robotic movements, he ascended the steps. At the top stood Rebecca James, not in the crisp lines of a uniform, but in a simple gray blouse and slacks, her empty sleeves swaying slightly in the breeze. She wore no medals today, yet her presence carried an authority that needed no adornment. Flanking her were three older veterans, their faces etched with the deep lines of decades spent in service. Among them, a silver-haired Marine, his chest a tapestry of ribbons stretching from shoulder to waist, rolled forward in his wheelchair. With a steady hand, he extended an envelope to the mayor, his gesture quiet but resolute. Dalton hesitated, then accepted it, his fingers brushing the paper as if it might burn. Inside was a single photograph. Rebecca watched his face shift, shock, then something deeper, as he studied the image. It captured her in Afghanistan, kneeling beside a rough-hewn wooden cross planted in a dusty field. Beside her, 5 Afghan girls in school uniforms gently laid wildflowers at its base. On the back, in careful black ink, were the words, Sarah Khan's Memorial, Kandahar. The girls still visit every year. The mayor's jaw clenched, his silence louder than any words. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice soft but piercing, cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. This, she said, is what honor looks like. No one clapped. No speeches followed. Only the faint rustle of flags in the wind and the steady breathing of those who had seen too much to abide disrespect masquerading as progress filled the air. For 2 hours they stood, unwavering. At precisely noon, without a word or signal, The veterans raised their hands in a single unified salute. Then, as quietly as they had come, they turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that roared louder than any speech could have. Later that morning, Rebecca was nearly done packing in her modest hotel room. Her small suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled with carefully folded clothes, a dog-eared copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and a pair of polished boots she hadn't worn on this trip. A knock at the door interrupted her. She opened it to find Mayor Dalton standing in the hallway, a shadow of the man who had spoken so confidently on the Memorial Day stage. His suit was rumpled, his tie askew, and dark circles carved deep lines beneath his eyes, betraying a sleepless night. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low, almost fragile. Rebecca studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, then stepped aside. "I'm about to check out," she said, her tone neutral. "I know," he replied, lingering near the door, awkward and uncertain, like a man who had rehearsed his words but found them inadequate. "That's why I came." He didn't sit, just stood there, shifting his weight. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, the words heavy with effort. "Not just for what I said on that stage, but for what I believed." Rebecca crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "Go on," he exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "I grew up at the tail end of the Iraq War. All I saw on the news was chaos, destruction, failure. I thought questioning patriotism, stepping away from military values made me enlightened, superior even." His eyes, raw with fatigue, met hers. "But I was wrong. I didn't understand a damn thing. I spoke out of fear, fear that honoring people like you would unravel everything I thought I was building." Rebecca let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate. He took a shaky breath. "I want to make it right. There's a veterans center on Elm Street, shuttered for 3 years. Budget cuts, low turnout. I want to reopen it. Not as some political stunt, but as a real place for healing, for connection." He stepped forward, his voice tinged with cautious hope. "And I want you to help lead it." Rebecca blinked, caught off guard, a rare crack in her composed exterior. "I don't live here," she said. "I wasn't planning to stay." "I know," he said quickly, "but maybe you could advise us, help us build something real, something that's not about optics, but about people." She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the last of the veterans had dispersed hours earlier, their quiet strength lingering in the air. After a long pause, she spoke. "I'll help," she said, her voice firm but measured. "But on one condition. This can't be about saving face or building your legacy. It has to be about service, not just military service, but community." The crisp autumn breeze wove through the streets of Maple Hill, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves that skittered along the sidewalks. 6 months had passed since that pivotal conversation, and the town square buzzed with a quiet, purposeful energy, not for a grand ceremony, but for a fresh start. A newly painted sign gleamed above a sturdy brick building on Elm Street. Maple Hill Veterans in Service Center. The once forsaken space had been reborn. Sunlight streamed through meticulously restored windows, bathing polished hardwood floors in a golden glow. The walls, now pristine, were adorned with framed photographs, not of battle but of service. Hands extended in kindness, faces lit with determination. Inside, the hum of connection filled the air. Volunteers bustled about, sorting food boxes for families in need. Teenagers from the local high school carefully organized stacks of donated clothing, their chatter mingling with the low voices of veterans seated at round tables, sharing stories and guidance with younger adults searching for direction. At the front of the room, a modest stage held a simple podium. Mayor Dalton stood there, his usual polished suit jacket replaced by a navy sweater that seemed to mirror the sincerity in his eyes. Gone was the rehearsed smile he'd once worn like a badge. His expression now carried the weight of someone who had learned to truly hear. "This center," he began, his voice steady but warm, "is more than just a building. It's a promise, a reminder that service takes many forms. Yes, military service, but also mentorship, education, compassion, and the courage to give second chances." His gaze drifted to the front row where Rebecca sat, her hands folded calmly in her lap, dressed in civilian clothes. Her face held no trace of expectation, only quiet observation. She had turned down the offer to run the center full-time, choosing instead to pour her energy into shaping its soul. Over the past months, she'd built bridges, connecting former service members with job resources, launching a weekly PTSD support group, and creating a mentorship program that paired veterans with at-risk youth. Dalton's voice softened as he continued, "Captain James showed me that patriotism isn't about grand speeches or slogans. It's about showing up for one another, especially when it's hard." The room responded with applause, not a roaring wave, but a steady, heartfelt acknowledgement of truth earned through action. As the crowd dispersed to explore the center, the space came alive with small, meaningful moments. Children scampered into the art therapy room, their laughter echoing as they dipped brushes into bright paints. In a cozy corner, older veterans sat over steaming cups of coffee, trading stories and chuckles over a deck of cards. In the career room, a young man hunched over a job application, his pen guided by the steady hand of a Marine who had once navigated the same uncertain path. Near the back, Rebecca stood with a high school senior, a young woman with bright eyes and big dreams of joining the Air Force. Rebecca didn't lecture or preach. She listened, answered questions with care, and offered guidance rooted in experience. When someone asked why she'd returned to Maple Hill, her answer was simple yet profound: because home is where you're needed. For the first time in years, Maple Hill truly felt like home again, not because of faded memories or nostalgic echoes, but because of a shared purpose taking root. This wasn't just her renewal, it was the town's. Service, she realized, never ended. It simply evolved, adapting to the needs of those who carried it forward. That evening, the town settled into a gentle quiet. The late October wind whispered against the window panes of Rebecca's grandfather's old house, now her own. She hadn't sold it, as she'd once planned. Instead, she'd breathed new life into it, restoring each room with care, preserving its warmth and the echoes of its history. The soft creak of floorboards followed her as she moved through the small living room, the house's heartbeat steady beneath her feet. Above the fireplace, on a mantel she'd sanded and stained herself in a woodworking class at the center, sat a simple wooden frame she'd crafted. Nestled inside, on a bed of black velvet, was the Medal of Honor she'd kept hidden in a drawer for years, its weight no longer a burden but a quiet reminder. Beside it stood 3 photographs: Captain Michael Rodriguez, his face alight with joy as he laughed with his daughters; Lieutenant Sarah Khan, gently tending to a child's bandaged leg in a dusty Afghan village; and Sergeant Damon Wallace, his grin wide beneath a helmet caked with desert sand. She hadn't placed the medal there for herself. It was for them, for remembrance, not for glory. In the weeks since the center's opening, something had shifted in Maple Hill, subtle but undeniable. At the library, children sat wide-eyed, interviewing veterans for a living history project, their pencils scribbling stories of courage and sacrifice. The high school had introduced a service learning course where students volunteered at local nonprofits and mentored younger kids at the elementary school. Even Sunday services carried a new tone, with sermons weaving themes of community and care into their messages. Maple Hill was waking up, not with fanfare, but with the quiet strength of people coming together. For Rebecca, the town was no longer just a place tied to her past. It was a living, breathing home, shaped by the hands of those who chose to serve, not out of obligation, but out of love for what could be. In the small town where Rebecca lived, gratitude had begun to ripple behind the usual heroes. It wasn't just soldiers who were honored anymore. The community had started to recognize the nurses who worked grueling shifts, the teachers who stayed late to help struggling students, the caregivers who offered comfort with quiet patience, and the postal workers who trudged through rain and snow to keep the town connected. Rebecca had always held a deep conviction, one that the town was only now beginning to embrace. Service wasn't about wearing a uniform or holding a title. It was about sacrifice, about showing up day after day, about giving when there was no reward in sight, no applause to chase. It was about heart, not headlines. Even Mayor Dalton, once known for his polished speeches and calculated appearances, had changed. Where he used to dominate conversations, he now listened, his eyes attentive, his responses measured. On Saturdays, he brought his young daughter to the community center, not for the flash of cameras or the praise of onlookers, but to quietly help serve lunch to the volunteers. He rolled up his sleeves, ladled soup, and wiped down tables, his daughter trailing behind him, learning by example. The transformation was subtle but profound, like a river slowly carving a new path through stone. Rebecca stood in her modest home, her gaze lingering on the photographs lining the mantel. The weight of memory pressed against her chest, but tears no longer came. She had cried enough in the past, mourning what was lost, what might have been. Now there was only a quiet ache, a soft echo of paths not taken, dreams left unfulfilled. Her fingers traced the edge of a worn picture frame, and her thoughts drifted to her grandfather, James "Pop" Harlan. He was a man of few words but immense wisdom, the kind that settled into your bones. He had taught her how to cast a fishing line with precision, how to mend a sagging fence under the summer sun, and most importantly, how to stand firm in her beliefs without ever needing to shout. His voice, steady and warm, still echoed in her mind, especially in moments of doubt. "True service never ends," he'd say, his words simple yet unyielding, like an oak rooted deep in the earth. It just finds new forms. Standing in that familiar house, surrounded by the weight of memory and the quiet hum of meaning, Rebecca finally grasped the depth of his words. For the first time in years, a sense of peace washed over her, gentle but certain, like the first light of dawn after a long night. In a world that often overlooked the understated power of dignity, Rebecca's story was a beacon, a reminder of something deeper than medals pinned to chests or speeches delivered to crowds. Service wasn't about basking in the glow of recognition. It was about standing tall for others, especially when no one was watching. It was the soldier who carried the weight of war, the parent who sacrificed dreams to raise a family, the teacher who poured their heart into lessons, the neighbor who offered a helping hand without being asked. Every act, no matter how small, carried weight. Every sacrifice mattered. In the shifting tides of modern America, where values seemed to bend with each passing year, and generations grappled with what it meant to live with purpose, Rebecca's story held a timeless truth. Respect for those who paved the way, for those who served in silence today, and for those still discovering what it meant to give, was a necessity that bound us all. Her grandfather's words lingered like a guiding star. True service never ends, it just finds new forms. Whether it was caring for a loved one, guiding a younger colleague, volunteering at a local shelter, or simply listening, truly listening, to someone whose voice had been ignored, service took countless shapes. It was the thread that wove together the fabric of a community, a nation, a life well lived.